Top GDP countries 2024.
Peru GDP $223 billion, GDP growth 3%. New Zealand GDP $250 billion, GDP growth 2.7%. Portugal GDP $254 billion, GDP growth 4%. Czech Republic GDP $282 billion, GDP growth 2.2%. Romania GDP $284 billion, GDP growth 2.2%. Finland GDP $297 billion, GDP growth 1.6%. Colombia GDP $314 billion, GDP growth 5.8%.
Chile GDP $317 billion, GDP growth 1.5%.
Pakistan GDP $348 billion, GDP growth 4%. Iran GDP $360 billion, GDP growth 3%. Vietnam GDP $366 billion, GDP growth 6%. Hong Kong GDP $369 billion, GDP growth 0.5%. Malaysia GDP $373 billion, GDP growth 5.6%. Philippines GDP $394 billion, GDP growth 6.5%. Singapore GDP $397 billion, GDP growth 4%. Denmark GDP $398 billion, GDP growth 2.3%. Egypt GDP $404 billion, GDP growth 5.9%. United Arab Emirates GDP $415 billion, GDP growth 4.2%. Bangladesh GDP $416 billion, GDP growth 6.4%. South Africa GDP $419 billion, GDP 1.9%. Nigeria GDP $441 billion, GDP growth 3.4%. Austria GDP $480 billion, GDP growth 2.6%. Norway GDP $482 billion, GDP growth 8.4%. Argentina GDP $487 billion, GDP growth 4%. Israel GDP $489 billion, GDP growth 5%. Ireland GDP $504 billion, GDP growth 5.5%. Thailand GDP $506 billion, GDP growth 3.3%. Belgium GDP $594 billion, GDP growth 2.1%. Sweden GDP $636 billion, GDP growth 2.9%. Poland GDP $679 billion, GDP growth 3.7%. Switzerland GDP $801 billion, GDP growth 2.2%. Turkey GDP $819 billion, GDP growth 2.7%. Saudi Arabia GDP $834 billion, GDP growth 7.6%. Netherlands GDP $1 trillion, GDP growth 3%. Indonesia $1.2 trillion, GDP growth 5.4%. Mexico GDP $1.3 trillion, GDP growth 2%. Spain GDP $1.4 trillion, GDP growth 4.8%. Australia GDP $1.6 trillion, GDP growth 4.2%. Brazil GDP $1.6 trillion, GDP growth 0.8%. Russia GDP $1.8 trillion, GDP growth 8.5%. South Korea GDP $1.8 trillion, GDP growth 2.5%. Canada GDP $2 trillion, GDP growth 3.9%. Italy GDP $2.1 trillion, GDP growth 2.3%. France GDP $3 trillion, GDP growth 2.9%. United Kingdom GDP $3.1 trillion, GDP growth 3.7%. India $3.2 trillion, GDP growth 8.2%. Germany GDP $4.3 trillion, GDP growth 2.1%. Japan GDP $4.9 trillion, GDP growth 2.4%. China $17.7 trillion, GDP growth 4.4%. USA GDP $23.3 trillion, GDP growth 3.7%. Thank you for watching this video. Please like, share and subscribe my YouTube channel.